Well, thank you everybody for joining us for this talk. Applying motivational psychology to engage landowners in conservation. And we have Jennifer Gooden here to speak to us. She is the president and CEO of the Biophilia Foundation. Hopefully I pronounced that right. And that's where she focuses on the strategic impact of conservation and restoration initiatives with interests in riparian restoration, rewilding, and private land conservation. She serves as a senior science advisor for Terra Habitus AC's work in northeastern Mexico. She has previously worked to increase awareness of the potential for restoration in the US-Mexico borderlands and has professional experience in urban sustainability and community capacity building to address complex social problems. And I'm really, really excited for her talk today. And with that, I will let Jennifer take it away.
Thank you. Thanks. It's really great to be a part of this series. So, as you said, I'm with the Biophilia Foundation, and this interest in engaging with private landowners comes from both our work at Biophilia and from my own research and personal interests. An important part of Biophilia's mission is advancing biodiversity conservation on private lands. And today I'm going to talk about some research, a combination of my own research and others' research on that process of working with landowners. And some of the impetus behind this is that often it can feel like programs that are targeted toward landowners are premised on an underlying belief that landowners are people that we need to educate, we need to monitor, we need to incentivize, or otherwise exert some influence over. But this is taking a different starting point that and one that I think landowners would might be more consistent with how they think about themselves, that they're people who love the land, maybe even see the land as part of themselves, but are operating with a complex set of competing needs and limited budget and time. So I think our question here is, how do we bring forth actions that create more space for wildlife and more space for ecosystem functions by engaging with private landowners? So here's what we're going to go today. To start out with just some background on how this question came about. And then there'll be dividing the concepts into four categories after that. We'll start out with just what is motivation? And then when rewards go wrong, then we'll talk about the seed of intrinsic motivation and how to foster that. And then finally, this process of internalizing motivation. And for each of those, I'll explain the concepts and give an example, and then an opportunity for the participants to reflect on a question and how that works in their own careers, their own lives. So some scope and caveats. One is that what I'm talking about today is working with willing landowners. Whether or not they're already doing conservation, they're people who already have some sympathies toward conservation or some interest in wildlife. What I'm talking about is not a magic bullet that could make someone who doesn't care about conservation suddenly want to be a great steward of their land. I mean, there are other methods that we can try to use to change hearts and minds, but that's a longer and that's a slower process. Another thing I wanted to mention is language. Just for convenience and brevity today, I'm going to use conservationist for people who are professionals working for conservation organizations, and landowners for people who are owning or managing land, whether that's a single person, a family, maybe even a communally managed land situation. And I recognize that many of those landowners also think of themselves as conservationists, but it just gets a little cumbersome to refer to people employed by professional environmental or wildlife organizations. So when I say conservationists, it's going to mean those who do that as their work, typically for a nonprofit organization or maybe for government. And then finally, I just wanted to add that most of our examples today are going to be about private landowners, but the theory and the concepts that underlie this conversation certainly are not restricted to landowners only. So if you don't work with landowners, I hope that you still be able to take something out of this today. You could change the examples to reflect more about your work environment, communicating with your colleagues, your direct reports, if you manage outreach programs or volunteers, or even your family. And a lot of this research was done about family and educational and employment context. So the same principles apply. Okay, so I can't see the chat. So my colleagues here are gonna summarize chat for me here. But I just want to start out with getting an idea of what organizations or people on this call are interested in doing. So if you work with landowners or other constituencies, could you give an example of an action that you would like them to take or that your organization would like landowners to take?
So we have donate a conservation easement.
Use smooth wire in their barbed wire fencing. Allow volunteer groups to remove invasive plants on their land.
Excellent. Okay, so really great and broadly applicable examples of private land conservation and illustrate some of the range of that too. And conservation easements are asking people to take a big step to make a permanent commitment, whereas something like allowing access for researchers or volunteers is more of a baby step in engaging with landowners in terms of the level of commitment that they have to make. Thank you. All right, so I'll start with some background here and just why I got interested in this. My entry point into this was I was doing a research project on European rewilding, and I was visiting sites that were managed by nonprofits, by governments, and by private landowners. And I had spent most of my career in the nonprofit sector, a little bit in municipal government, and I just expected that to be where the exciting things were happening, I guess. And when I visited some of the sites that were being developed by as private nature reserves, um, I see a question. I'll come to that in just a second.
Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. There's a clarifying question real quick. Does landowner include cities, counties, and other public entities for what you're speaking to here?
Yeah, my examples here are at the psychological level. So they are about interacting with people. So most of the research that's out there is at the person to person kind of at that level, but there has been research that shows that the same concepts and frameworks apply if you elevate it to a level of policy or of institutions. So I would say the answer is yes, but my examples today mostly focus on private landowners. That makes sense?
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And feel free to jump in anytime with clarifying questions. I don't want anyone to feel confused as I go forward. So I'm visiting these rewilding sites, and it turns out that the work by private landowners is just really exciting. They're very innovative, and when they decide to do something, they could move very quickly. So I went back and looked at the literature, and at that time, so this was about 10 years ago, when I first started this rewilding work, and I found something very different that I felt like didn't explain the perspective from the landowner's perspective. I ended up doing a literature review and summarized some of the themes from it, but a lot of them were very, you could even say, skeptical of private landowners' motives. So these were a few of the concepts that I found in the literature that private land conservation brought a lot of cultural conflict, especially if it was from a person from a wealthier country who was doing private land conservation in the global south, that it had to do with exclusion, that there were self-serving motives, that it was about accumulating wealth, perpetuating inequities, and even green grabbing, which is land grabbing that's applied to conservation purposes. And I think that this is all a really important perspective on power and equity. And at the same time, it's not at all how landowners are thinking about themselves. And so using these kinds of concepts to figure out how to engage with them was not going to be fruitful. So that was the background. That led me to looking at motivation and what is it that really makes people tick? Why would they take on such big projects as something that they just wanted to do? And so that came to the study of motivation. And for purposes today, when we talk about motivation, motivation is a very general term. So it's defined as the process of initiating, sustaining, or directing psychological or physical activities. So what is the thing that happens inside of us that starts that activity, that keeps it going, and that gives us some direction around that? And it can be a very wide range of influences. We have economic or financial influences on our behavior. We have sociocultural influences. That might be something like peer pressure. Psychological influences, that could be something like the need for belonging. And even biological influences. We might not think it affects our behavior so much, but some of you may know about the hungry judge effect, in which parole outcomes were found to correlate with how far away from a break judges had been, and so serious consequences just from something like hunger. And these different levels, these motivations operate at different levels. So some of them can be very conscious, others can be unconscious, and then they all interact in ways that are hard to map out and explain. Sometimes they can coexist and even strengthen each other, and sometimes they can conflict and cancel each other out. There are some related concepts here that aren't exactly what I'm talking about today, or at least not the language I'm using. So one word is motives. I think motive is actually a more accurate term for what I'm talking about. It's the reason for behavior, the thing that directs people's energies. But in our common language, motive kind of has a little bit of a suspicious tone to it. So I use the term motivation or motivations instead. Motivation is not the same thing as a goal either. A goal is what we mean to achieve. And so I think about a goal as what you want to achieve, but not necessarily why. And then finally, reasons are not necessarily the same thing as motivations either. Reasons would be something that a person used to explain their behavior. And as we'll see today, a lot of these underlying concepts don't really operate at the conscious level. So if you ask somebody why they did them, the concepts I talked about today are not going to be the answer, even if it's something that like operates within all of us. So reasons might be something that could be created after the fact to explain it in an intelligible way to yourself or to another person. So a few examples. We got examples from participants doing a conservation easement, using smooth wire and fencing to help reduce impacts on wildlife or grant access. It could also be something like, well, my own example of rewilding private land. It could be creating riparian buffers, planting hedgerows, or something like using regenerative grazing practices in agricultural land. Okay, so I think a fun place to start is thinking about the landowners that we know. What might motivate them to protect, conserve, or restore land? And if you're already working with landowners and you've had this conversation, just take a second to reflect on what you've heard. And if you haven't, you can also just try to put yourself in their shoes and think of some possibilities. So I'll let this go over. I'll give a few seconds for this to go over to chat.
So one thing that I can think of is keeping a working land working and functioning. And we also have protection from future development, and from Yachting, a similar thing, a desire to maintain a sustainable ecosystem on their land. And then if they can't develop that land because it's on a floodplain or if it's too steep.
Yeah, okay, great. I can give some examples from my interviews too. These certainly weren't reflective of landowners in general. These were people who had already done a lot for conservation. But it was interesting that I went through and analyzed the interviews and actually just like counted statements of reasons that people gave me for their work. The category of personal and family was the thing that most came into it. People doing it to improve the land for their children, or they had found it just really personally fulfilling to do that work and feel like they had made a difference in the world. Ecology and conservation came in as the next big category, social and community. And then much lower on the list, I saw financial and like legal and process reasons among this particular group. So when you think about motivation, there are different ways that we can categorize motivation. And I think one of the most important and the central to the concepts we're talking about here today is to break it down into its source. Does that motivation come from inside, from within oneself, or does it come from outside? If it comes from inside, that's called intrinsic motivation. And that would be things like you do it because of a sense of purpose or your own interest or curiosity, or it gives you a feeling of pride. Whereas extrinsic motivation is whenever the source is from outside of you, and that might be something like grades, money, or peer pressure. These are definitions. Sorry for all the text on this slide, but I want to make sure everyone knows exactly what we're talking about here. So intrinsic motivation occurs when a person does something because they feel inherently satisfied while they're doing it, or they find inherent value in the outcome. So like as a shorthand, the way to think about this is like doing the activity is its own reward. It feels good to do that. Extrinsic motivation involves doing something because it leads to a different outcome. So the activity, instead of being inherently valuable, it's instrumental. So the classic extrinsic motivators are carrots and sticks, carrots being things like incentives and accolades, and sticks being like punishment or threats. And the way we're talking about it today, we're talking about incentives for a particular behavior. But as I mentioned earlier, the stuff applies across different levels and scales. And so it actually is true that some people just are more intrinsically motivated in life overall, and some people are more extrinsically motivated in life. And when you look at that at the whole person level, people who are overall more intrinsically motivated tend to perform better in academics, better in sports, better in health, better in therapy, and they're more likely to act pro-socially and pro-environmentally than people who are extrinsically motivated. So an example, one of intrinsic and one of extrinsic. So for an intrinsic example, the situation might be something like a farmer notices some birds that he hasn't seen before on an old wetland near his property. So he decides to let some vegetation grow up in that area so he can see what happens. And I think this is curiosity. It's, there's something here that I noticed and I want to follow that thread. Whereas an extrinsic motivator might be a developer purchases a property on a green belt, and that has a high value riparian area. City government, let's say, is concerned about impacts on wildlife and offers the developer a financial incentive in order to increase the housing setbacks to protect the riparian area. So, in the intrinsic, it's something that is self-directed, and extrinsic, somebody that is coming from the outside and offering a reason. Okay, so another chance to apply this, and this one's a little different. It's not about landowners, but about ourselves. So I think probably many of the people on this call have done something to make their household a little more environmentally friendly in some way. And so just curious if somebody can think of something that they've done that was intrinsically motivated and something they've done that is extrinsically motivated. Also, no pressure to put it in the chat. I mean, I think the main thing is that you take a minute to reflect on it because it helps things sink in a little.
We have growing a vegetable garden, which is intrinsic, and built a house off the grid. Oh, planting native species to encourage local wildlife. Use green products so I don't pollute the air in my home.
Lots of intrinsic
Vegetate
ones
an
there.
empty lot. Yeah.
Anybody doing things for outside reasons? Anybody concerned about a water bill or peer pressure ever in affect actions?
I feel like some of these could be both intrinsic and extrinsic. Like I put window covers on our house, both because I want to use less energy, but also because of the savings.
Yeah, okay, remember that thought too, because this gets into a little bit more nuanced than either or later. Great, thank you.
Yeah. And we've got a couple of extrinsic, so added solar to reduce energy bill and installed a heat pump to get the rebate, new shower head, that sort of thing.
Great. Yeah, excellent. Okay, so everybody gets the idea of intrinsic and extrinsic. Okay, so this section is about, I call it when rewards go wrong. This builds on this concept of this distinction of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So this field of research came about in the 70s, actually, with kind of a puzzle around behavior. So one example would be kids' behavior. And it's just interesting, right, that a lot of kids before they go to school really love books and they love to read. And then something happens when they go to school and reading becomes a chore. So why does this change happen? It's the same behavior. And it's not, at that time, it wasn't really explainable by what was happening in psychology. So some of you may have heard of B.F. Skinner, who was a psychologist working in around the 50s, and he was studying operant conditioning. So that might be something like, working with a rat, and every time the rat presses a lever, it gets a pellet. And if the rat is rewarded like that, it's going to push the lever more. And under that operant conditioning framework, everybody thought that motivations could be added together. So if you have one source of motivation and then you add another source of motivation, that you ought to have double the amount of motivation, or at least more than you had before. But then studies found that asking people to do enjoyable things like reading or playing a game, and then paying them for that behavior actually reduced their motivation to do that activity. And then similarly, not paying them to do the activity, but letting them do it, but limiting their freedom around it. So it might be like limiting, limiting their freedom to decide which activity to do or how much time to allot to it, things like that. They also reduced intrinsic motivation. So what's happening here? So I have a little schematic. I hope this helps explain it. So on the chart, the vertical axis here is just total amount of motivation, and this block is a unit. I've given put a tree on it because that's supposed to represent intrinsic motivation. And so you think, okay, I've got a person that is, let's say, our landowner here has this much motivation, and then we think, okay, well, let's add a financial incentive to that, and what happens? So under the older framework, the operant conditioning, you would think, okay, well, we can just add these together. So now we'll have additional behavior beyond what we had before, and M1, which marked our previous level of behavior, ought to increase to M2. But instead, what often happens, is that the financial incentive actually erodes or crowds out the intrinsic motivation. And so as always, the same example with the kids, their intrinsic desire to do that behavior, to read, or in this case, potentially the intrinsic desire to take care of the land, gets eaten away by the external reward. And so you might think, why does this matter? M2 is still higher than M1, and that's true. So you might have more of the behavior that you wanted to. The real danger comes if that is not a permanent incentive. So if for some reason that financial incentive went away, the amount of the person's motivation is going to be lower than they started with, and potentially you could end up in a worse situation than you were before the financial incentive. If you're interested in social science, you might also see this referred to as crowding out of motivation, or motivation crowding. That tends to get used a little bit in the economics literature and psychology. Is the overjustification effect, as in it's overjustified. There are just too many reasons for doing it. And this is another little schematic that I hope can show how this works out more over a period of time. So the top chart here, we have the amount of motivation, and the bottom chart, the amount of behavior. So starting point, we have someone who has a high level of intrinsic motivation and a low level of extrinsic motivation, and their behaviors just kind of averaging out a little bit of change over time. Then we add a reward for doing that behavior, and what happens? Extrinsic motivation, the outside reason for doing it, shoots up. And correspondingly, the intrinsic motivation for doing that can go down. They're not always equal in magnitude, but just for a schematic here. And then the the amount of behavior that you see, so the amount of conservation action could go up. Then if the reward is terminated, what you would see would be a removal of that extrinsic factor, so a decrease in extrinsic motivation, not necessarily any recover of intrinsic motivation, and a reduction in behavior. So hopefully that kind of shows it on more of a timeline. And the way I think about this is, if this happens to me, what's going on in my head? So say I love bird watching, and I enjoy doing bird counts with a local organization. And then I get a contract job and I'm paid per hour for doing that. And something in my mind starts to say, well, if I'm getting paid for this, it must be work. And work is not leisure. And therefore, I'm going to stop doing it for fun and only do it if I get paid. That's kind of the basic concept behind this. So that takeaway number one from the talk is that we really do not want to crush intrinsic motivation. If we can avoid that, we want to, because intrinsic motivation is something that can be a lot more enduring, and yeah, a lot more enduring than extrinsic motivation. So a scenario in which you can apply this. So let's think back on the example I gave about a farmer who saw the birds around the wetland. So some vegetation grows back. He starts to see even more birds around the wetland. He puts up a trail cam because he wants to see what comes through at times of the day when he's not there. He's showing pictures to his grandkids when they come visit. And then the next summer, say a municipal government agency passes an ordinance that prohibits cutting vegetation around the wetlands and introduces a fine for doing so. So setting aside behavior right now, what are the factors that are affecting this person's motivation? And this is kind of, I think, a harder one to put in the chat. So feel free to do that if you'd like to, but if not, you can just take a few minutes to reflect on that, and then I can come back to it. Okay, so I'll give some of my thoughts on this. So what's happening now is we have competing influences here. We have a person who's already doing something that is exciting to them, but at the same time, there's now a feeling of an outside force that is affecting the range of possible outcomes. So at this stage, we don't know what's going to happen to behavior. This certainly doesn't mean that that this farmer is going to cut down the wetland by any means. But what we now see is that we've got motivations coming from different sources, and we need to start thinking about how those interact. Is there anything else that added by the group?
Yeah. So we had some people that were talking about the appreciation of nature and of the birds and the experiment itself, but then also the flip side of, like, maybe he doesn't like the government telling him what to do. And then one that says compromises self-empowerment.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, those are both really good tie-ins to the next section. So I'm going to move on to part 4, and like that phrase, compromising self-empowerment. So just a refresher on where we are so far. So we know what intrinsic and extrinsic motivation are. We know that intrinsic motivation is a good thing, and we want to, if there's a landowner with an intrinsic motivation to protect or conserve land, we want to do what we can to maintain that. We know as a corollary that because intrinsic motivation comes from within a person, somebody outside, like me or you, cannot create intrinsic motivation in another person. So what can we do? I mean, there's certainly things that we have goals for what we hope to achieve by working with private landowners. But if we know we can't achieve that intrinsic motivation, like, where does that leave us? And one way I think about this is that intrinsic motivation is like a seed. So there's, I can talk to a seed all day long, and there's nothing I can do to make that seed sprout. But I can put that seed in conditions, or try to create conditions that help it sprout. So for a seed, that might be, or it is, putting it into the right kind of soil, into the right amount, giving it the right amount of sun, and applying the right amount of water for that particular plant. And if my actions in creating the right conditions align with the seed's own ability, internal ability to sprout, then we have a successful sprouting of this. So, that's similar to the way that intrinsic motivation works, and the conditions for this are three things. It's autonomy. So this is really close to that sense of self-empowerment, and not being told by someone outside or an entity outside what to do. I think there's a government example here. And then two others, competence and relatedness. This all comes from a I guess theory is the right word, in psychology called self-determination theory. The thwart theory here is referring more to its role as an explanatory model rather than a hypothesis. This is work that was developed by my scholars DC and Ryan, and who have written very comprehensively about this. So there's a lot of literature out there if others want to look into this. But I think some things that are important to note about it is that unlike a lot of other psychology, which really gets developed by testing undergraduates who get a little bit of class credit in exchange for participating in experiments on campus, this has been validated in cross-cultural contexts. So US, Australia, Belgium, Mexico, Malaysia, China, Philippines, across different ages and across different socioeconomic levels. So I would say that's a really highly validated theory. And what it says is that all human beings have three basic psychological needs. And that's the autonomy, the competence, and relatedness. And if those needs are satisfied, those are the conditions in which intrinsic motivation can flourish. And if those needs are not satisfied, that thwarts intrinsic motivation. So what autonomy is, it is a sense of volition and an ability to self-direct. The person feels that their actions reflect who they really are. So basically that means it's not a result of external pressures. A person feels like they're in the driver's seat in their own life. Autonomy is not the same thing as independent. So it doesn't mean that they don't want to work with other people. It just means they want to be making decisions about where their life is going. The second one is competence, which is the feeling that a person is capable and can achieve their own goals. And there are really two elements of this. One is the ability to develop and express mastery over something, mastery over skills or knowledge. And the other is the act of learning itself, which can be intrinsically satisfying. And then the last is called relatedness. And that is all about being connected to others, about having caring relationships, belonging to a community. It's this interpersonal dimension. And, and there are other bodies of research that have found that the social connection is often something that helps sustain activity. So, for example, in a study of volunteers for environmental organizations, people will come for the environmental work, but when they survey them over time and ask them, why did you come? The reasons will change toward attachments to the people and attachments to the place. Oh yeah, and I just in case people want to do a little more reading, and just a paper here so that you can see the authors, Richard Ryan and Edward DC. And this is one paper that applies it to the field of education, but like I said, they've written prolifically, and you can find their work applying to a lot of different sectors. So to give an applied example to this, go back to the reading example and try to explain why it is that a kid might shift from loving reading to disliking reading. So before the child goes to school, their reading is probably very self-directed. They get to decide what books they're looking at, for how long. It's part of their play activity. But then we go to school and we take away autonomy by dictating what, when, and how much to read. And then by giving an extrinsic reason to read, an external reason. So that's like good grades or bad grades, which further takes away autonomy. The child's skill in reading is probably increasing, but someone else is evaluating that, which again is shifting away that autonomy. And then possibly the context is shifting too. Perhaps the child was reading in a parent's lap at home, and now is reading by herself at a desk. And so that intrinsic motivation to read is diminished, and the joy in it becomes a job. So this takes us to takeaway two, a two-part takeaway. So the first rule is just do no harm. Like if you if nothing else, just try not to thwart intrinsic motivation that's already out there. And then next level bonus points would be really working to proactively create those conditions in which it can thrive. Okay, so another chance to apply it. So this isn't so much an example as a quandary. So let's say conservation professionals want to achieve specific conservation outcomes on private land, yet we know that trying to impose our own will can undermine intrinsic motivation. Any thoughts on how this tension might be resolved? I can offer a couple of my own. We'll see if anything else comes in.
We have a
Sorry.
couple of answers. So one is plant the seed, give them an info sheet on the benefits of conservation easements, for example. So basically supplying the education about benefits.
Mm.
Another one's come from a place of listening. And then also, see, public meetings and focus groups. And then, see, find examples where private landowners might already be engaging in similar or some of the desired behaviors.
Yeah, okay, excellent. So really listening to what they're looking for. That's what I heard. Um, which appeals to them, or speaks to them taking the lead, being in the driver's seat. Educational materials might appeal to that competence need, that basic need for competence. So giving them the tools that they need to be really informed about a decision. Public meetings hits the relatedness piece. And then I think that already engaging circles back to autonomy. So some of the things that I would think about in this situation too would be starting with their goals and letting that all come out first, and then finding if there are places where they might align with your own goals. Another could be if it's determined that conservation is already something that is of interest to them or they would like to do, positioning yourself as a resource to support that. That can make sure, or it can help ensure that that their autonomy comes forward. Another could be talking about their pain points and whether any of those could be addressed with your program. And depending on how well you know them and at what level you engage with them, it could also be something as basic as talking about their values, like what's really important to them, and are there ways that conservation can help them not only support their own values, but express their own values? And maybe the language around that is different than the language you would use, but there could be a common understanding of the same types of practices. So I think what all these things have in common is that they're starting with a perspective shift that's the landowner's perspective primary, and then our conservation perspective secondary. Not footnote, not saying that means to compromise the conservation organization's own values, but rather to look for places where there is an overlap. Okay, so you might be thinking at this point, but wait, people do all kinds of things that aren't necessarily intrinsically motivated and are not fully explainable by rewards and punishment. So some kids try to do well at school. There are a lot of people who do their best at work in ways that aren't explainable by salary. And we do other things in our lives that aren't inherently satisfying, like laundry. So what explains this? And this comes back to the nuance in extrinsic motivation that we referred to earlier. It's not a pure either or. Intrinsic motivation doesn't really have these subcategories, but extrinsic motivation has been broken down into, I would say, along a continuum of, it's all extrinsic in that it's originating from outside the person, but it differs by degree of exactly how extrinsic or intrinsic it is. So the exact names of these aren't really that important to take away, but the fact that it's a continuum. So external regulation refers to pure rewards and punishments. The motivation is clearly coming from the outside. An example for this might be financial incentives or fines. The next level, introjection, that an example of that could be something like social pressure or external pressure to do something like praise, guilt, or shame. At the identification level, a person, this starts to shift, and the person starts to identify with the reason. So let's say a person identifies and starts to see it personally important because it resonates with their values. And then finally, integration is something that's initially internal, but it becomes congruent with the person's values and behavior, and therefore becomes internally driven. So, example of that might be a volunteer who comes to a program to hang out with friends, but then really gets excited about it and takes that cause on as his own. So none of these things are insignificant. In all of these cases, we have the conservation behavior happening, even though they're in this extrinsic bucket. Um, and um, and there are factors that affect where along this continuum someone or an action falls. And fortunately, nothing new to learn here. They happen to be the same three factors that foster intrinsic motivation. So autonomy, I put efficacy here, but competence is the word I use elsewhere, and social connection or relatedness. So moving from the left side of that continuum where it's really external to the right side of that extrinsic continuum where it starts to look a lot like intrinsic motivation, it depends on the extent to which the person who's acting has autonomy, competence, and relatedness as part of their conditions. So a few examples of what that might look like. You would get closer to the right side of that continuum in a situation where you're really, let's say you had a rewards program, and rather than framing that as an incentive, you might frame it as recognition of someone's work, really putting them back in the autonomy position. Or like we talked about earlier, supporting landowner efforts. Um, Efficacy example could be really emphasizing learning, not so much us teaching, but a person's, potentially even self-directed learning or responding to their own curiosity, and especially allowing their own expertise on the land to be expressed. And then on the relatedness side, and there are some really good indications that peer-to-peer networks of landowners are a very powerful tool for communicating these kinds of messages and developing innovation. And some of that's really even within the private land conservation sector. Places where there tend to be really good peer-to-peer networks also are often hotspots of private land conservation. Just to tie this back to what we talked about earlier, so at the left end of that intrinsic motivation spectrum, that is where you run into the risk of the overjustification effect. So if something is in that extrinsic bucket and you have a situation in which autonomy, competence, and relatedness are low, then you have a risk of the overjustification effect. As you move over closer to that intrinsic like motivation, the risk of overjustification effect goes way down. Okay, so let's see. Takeaway 3 then is that we want to aim for internalization. And that doesn't mean we're always going to get there. That's a really high bar. But if we're just thinking about extrinsic factors as we develop our programs and as we communicate them, we want to be thinking about the goal of moving external factors, helping a person internalize those. Okay, so another chance to apply it here. One of the first responses we had today about an action that we'd like landowners to take was a conservation easement. So that is one example of a financial incentive program. And so how would you design a financial incentive program, whether that one or any other, considering what we know about internalization of motivation and the risks of undermining intrinsic motivation? It's a pretty broad question, but you can address any aspect of it that is interesting to you. So when, do we have? Yeah.
Well, this was actually an answer to the last one, but it was a little bit late, but I think it also applies here. So involve the landowner as much as possible in the process. And I think that still kind of applies whether you're using I think developing a financial incentive program or, just trying to get them engaged. And then we also have offer to pay for the valuation of the land.
So removing financial barriers there. Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that that strikes me is that intrinsic motivation often, like one of the themes of areas in which it gets undermined is when it feels really transactional. It's like a tit for tat. If you do this, I will give you this, or if you do that, I will help you in this way. And the same programs can often be delivered without the transactional element to communication. So if you can shift from transactional language to relational language, and like we talked about earlier about support, that is something that can help communicate. You can use it both in the communication and in the design of programs.
Yeah, well, so right at the end of that, someone mentioned the plant swap, trading invasive plants for native plants, and that program was very transactional at the start. 1 for 1, take out your invasive grass, we'll give you milkweed, but has become a program where instead of 1 to 1, we're seeing people removing, 4 or 5 fountain grass for just one replacement plant. So it's kind of ballooned a little bit where people are just doing it.
Mhm. Yeah, so it sounds like that's a situation where that internalization is happening. It originally started maybe farther left on that extrinsic spectrum as something that an outside organization asked to do, and then I don't know the particular landowners, but just from what I've heard, it sounds like it became resonant with the landowner's own values, and they started to adopt that more as something that was important to them and expressive of who they are.
Yeah, and then one other comment real quick, develop a community aspect to the incentive program and leverage the landowner groups mentioned to come together to brainstorm, identify needs, and then move together towards solutions.
Yeah, I think this is huge, and it comes from a different body of research, but work on it's really important who the messenger is. And I think one of the exciting things about networks is that they provide a lot of opportunities for messengers who are very like the person who's the target recipient of the message. And that's another thing that really increases uptake. Um, when I was doing my interviews, they were in a lot of different places in 14 different countries. But it really struck me how many of them said, especially when they first started, that they felt very alone. People would use words like, my neighbors thought I was an alien, or they would just have no idea what I was doing. And over time, as networks developed, and a lot of those same people were really instrumental in building those networks. But that feeling goes away, and there's much more of a feeling of community around the work. Okay, so I have a couple of dialogue examples here. These are a little bit heavy-handed, but they just kind of illustrate some of the principles. So um, I'll read this to you and ask you to think about ways that this could be improved. Again, it's a little on the nose here, but so we have a conservation professional saying to a landowner, I noticed you started using cover crops. That's good. It's a step in the right direction. And she responds, yeah, I decided to give it a try after our last discussion. Thanks. Um, and he comes back with, that's great. It's what we've been recommending for a while, so I'm glad you're now on board. Keep it up, and I'm sure you'll see the benefits. So it's all positive, but are there ways that this dialogue could have gone differently in terms of autonomy, competence, or relatedness?
It's like one person said, don't qualify the action you want to see. And another one said, ask how easy or hard it was to implement and if their experience is confirming the recommendation.
Yeah, excellent. I like the idea of just stopping with that's great, like say something positive there. So that final comment especially is shifting the leadership position back to himself. So instead of following, I love also the comment about asking more questions, like approaching that with curiosity, like why did you do that, or what made you excited about that particular aspect of farming. That would be something that would really create the conditions for more internalization or support intrinsic motivation, whereas this was like shifting that himself back into the driver's seat. A couple other things that are happening here is that not completely related to these three concepts, but the praise is very surface level. It's not specific, so you question whether he's even really thinking about it. And there's like kind of a lack of personal connection here. He's not acknowledging the landowners' initiative or their personal journey. And if he said something instead like, I think it's, I really admire how you took the time to understand these benefits and apply them to your land. It looks like you're really committed to the health of the environment. Something like that. That's not superficial praise, but specific and genuine. That would be much more reinforcing.
Yeah, and there was a couple last ones. So another one asking if he can assist in their future efforts. And
Excellent.
then if the farmer knows if there's anybody else that might be interested in learning more, essentially.
Yeah, great one. Again, using natural networks. And one more, so this time we have our conservation professionals saying, I've already mapped out the areas where we should focus reforestation efforts. This will cover all the critical zones on your property. And we have the landowning couple saying, oh, okay, but we were thinking of keeping some of that area for agricultural use. We can adjust the plan later if needed, but this is going to give us a strong start, and it's important to begin where the impact will be greatest. So in this case, the conservationist does acknowledge that they've said something, acknowledges the concern, but then they steer the conversation back to their preferred solution, and they don't have that curiosity or really wanting to explore the landowner's perspective, or maybe there's an alternative approach that achieves both goals.
One of the comments in the chat is, let's work together to map out the areas.
Yeah. Participatory mapping. So we're not going to go through this one, but if anybody wants to screenshot it or take a picture, these are some questions that, like if you want to do some further reflection, these are some things that you could think about as you're working on your programs or your communication in whatever domain that is. And if you wanted to really take it seriously, you can rate them with always, sometimes, rarely, and never, just to give yourself some feedback on how you're working in this area. References from the presentation, and my email address. As I said, I'm with the Biophilia Foundation. You're welcome to contact me. Certainly, if you have any questions. Just a few wrap-up thoughts here. One is I just want to acknowledge that this is often operating below the conscious level. So if you give someone a survey and say, why are you doing this? The chances of them saying autonomy, competence, or relatedness are exceedingly low. It's something that's common to all of us, but it's not like we're all out there thinking, I really need to get my basic psychological need for autonomy met. But there is that kind of spidey sense about it, right? That things don't feel comfortable when these principles are violated. And if you're on the receiving end of someone trying to take away your autonomy, you don't like how that feels. So there's been this increasing interest in private land conservation, especially the last 10 years as it became more acknowledged at the international level as an important tool for land conservation. And those who are working in this field know that private land conservation requires a different set of tools and a different set of skills from advocating for conservation on public lands, or even directly managing land that's owned or managed in some way by the conservation organization. So I hope for those who are on today that understanding these concepts, the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, the importance of autonomy and competence and relatedness, and the fact that you can create conditions that move people along that continuum by having those right conditions in place. I hope those can help us improve and optimize tools that we have, like landowner education, financial incentives, or behavior change programs, which basically have as their starting point a, an, an autonomy that lies with the initiator of the behavior change program. So things generally that we can do, starting with what's important to landowners, looking for alignment, offering to serve as a resource, discussing values and where there can be overlap. All of these things are principles that can be applied in day-to-day interactions with landowners. So I think we do have plenty of time for questions if people have any.
Okay, so if anybody has questions, feel free to go ahead and ask.
This is Claire. I think I have more of just a comment as opposed to a question. Again, really just, I think, this is that fine line of being able to provide the why it's important to people. And it's like you said, it's totally two different skill sets about, you need to get that buy-in from the personal landowner to get on board with these concepts. So I think it's a great way. And I think I appreciate this presentation a lot because it really does provide that different perspective, and we want to make sure that people are aware of pushing them towards that intrinsic motivation about why it's important to do this, but then hopefully they get some value out of it.
Great, thank you. Perhaps this is of interest to you all. I ended up doing a later research project trying to answer that question of why it was people who took on really big conservation projects, like creating private nature reserves, why would they, why take on these projects that become sometimes lifelong projects and almost always end up being so much more work and money and time than they ever anticipate from the outset. And especially if you have some money and you care about conservation, there's the option of making a donation to a conservation organization, maybe even getting your name on it, and achieving the conservation goal, yet people want to do it themselves. And I ended up finding out that people got a lot of satisfaction out of having a meaningful personal project. And there is some theory in psychology around the importance of personal projects. And they have a lot of the same factors that we talked about today make personal projects meaningful. So autonomy is in there, competence is in there, and a community or interpersonal context. And then a couple other things in there is that people have to find them as something that is meaningful to them. And then there's an inverse correlation with stress. So to the extent that that your personal project increases your stress, it makes it like a little less of an enjoyable personal project. But one of my own thoughts that I add to that is that I think nature projects as a personal project are really powerful because we know that being out in nature is an antidote to stress. So they have their own, in some ways, at least some built-in mechanism to help counter the stress that comes with any kind of big project.
I have a question. It may be outside of your research or field of experience, but do you see a difference in motivations or ways to engage better with landowners on the wildland urban interface versus more rural landowners?
So you're asking if you would, if there are more opportunities there, or if you would use different tools?
If you would take different approaches or use different tools, or if it's kind of the same no matter what.
I would say the underlying principles would be the same, but the issues of concern, of course, will be different. You would have more potential for human-wildlife conflict in that interface, probably more concern around things like catastrophic wildfire, where there's the potential for property damage. So the questions are going to be more about that interface of people and wildlife, but I would say that the autonomy piece of it is still pretty central to it, especially autonomy.
Great, thank you. Donna, did you have a question?
Yes. Thank you so much. What a great presentation. And I'm apologizing now because I came in a little bit late and then I had an interruption. And so I'm looking forward to, I saw it was recorded. So I'm hoping I'm going to get sent the presentation recording afterwards so I can catch up on those things I missed. So I wanted to say just that just information, and I just love kind of that psychology of everything and really appreciate all of your research and your findings. I'm approaching this I'm a water conservation coordinator here at the City of Mesa. We have grass to xeriscape incentives for people to change out their landscapes and remove the grass and embrace the desert. And, that kind of gets into personal projects, I hope. We're also trying to figure out, and we are embarking on some research ourselves with the Water Use It Wisely campaign, just to look at what are those motivational messages. So I'm really looking at, like, from that social marketing perspective, what is it that's going to motivate people? What is it that's going to get their attention? And to, motivate them just to take action, I guess, is like you're saying too. So I don't know if you have any insights from that perspective, more from a messaging, kind of just that outside messaging. Of course, we're all struggling too with even how to message to people anymore, because that's all changing too. How to get that trust. I think that's another big one.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, even just breaking through the noise with messaging. I mean, that's the hard thing, right? We're all processing so much information.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is a fun one for me because I'm actually just started doing a program which my neighborhood applied for funding from the city to do a lawn conversion. So we've been working on this here in our little neighborhood too. And so yeah, several things come to mind. One is that our neighborhood found out about it from another neighborhood that was nearby that had participated in a xeriscape program that had incentives. And I would say that the project resonates with our own values already. People are already interested in that. And that my experience of going through the process is that there was nothing really to undermine that. There are kind of, I won't get into the too much of the technicalities of it. There are two programs here. One is basically, if you do it, you get this much money back on a per square foot basis. And the other one is more of a grant that can help you do some of the things that you need to set up a project like landscape design. I felt like the staff really acknowledged that our neighborhood, first of all, we all know it's about turf conversion, but they also acknowledge that we might have other goals for that. Like, we don't have a place where neighbors can get together outside in our area, and we'd like to set that up. And learning that we could incorporate some of those goals into it really made that program even more attractive for us. So we had the networking social side of things. We had the feeling that that we were that the program was responding in the direction that we wanted to go. And I don't think that the competence piece has come into it yet, but I expect that it will in a big way as we get involved. And hands in the dirt. I mean, people love that, right? And whether or not it's the most efficient way of getting plants in the ground, I think it does a lot for people's values.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to take any other questions. And if not, my email address is here, and people are welcome to contact me separately with other questions.
Right. It seems everyone has asked their questions for now, at least.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you.
Share.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was an amazing presentation, and I think we all learned a lot, and the activity in the chat was great. We did record this, so we'll send out the recording to everyone once it's converted and up on YouTube. So give me just a little bit of time to get that done. But thank you again, Jennifer. This was amazing.
Great, my pleasure.